Hey RICC, we've been working through a series on the Gospel of John, and I've been really excited working through this series because it really puts Jesus at center stage and then lets us know what the good news is as a result of who Jesus is. Well, one of the things about doing a large series like this is that I just can't fit every story from the Gospel of John into this series, even though there's some of them I really don't want to skip. So what I would like to do is explore some of those other stories that I won't be able to get into our main series. We've just finished John chapter 1, and now we're going to be doing John chapters 2 and 3 this week. The first sign of Jesus' ministry, Jesus saved a young couple from social disaster. So let's take out our Bible. Here it is. John chapter 2. On the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water," and they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast." So they took it. When the master of the feast tasted the water now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now." This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Now this is a true story, but it has a lot of intentional details. That is, things that John noticed as he looked back on this event that he realized were pointing forward to something really, really important, namely the death and the resurrection of Jesus. First of all, we see that the story happened on the third day. And Jesus says, "My hour has not yet come," when Mary asked him to help out. What this does is it alerts us that there is some connection to Jesus' death and resurrection, because Jesus was raised to life on the third day. And everywhere else in the Gospel of John, when he talks about "my hour has come," he's talking about his death on the cross. Okay, now the story goes kind of like this. First of all, we have a wedding feast that Jesus and his disciples have been invited to. Now, a wedding in those days would go on for at least 3 days. And they would have someone who is in charge of the wedding, who is called the master of the feast. It's sort of like an MC that we might have in a wedding today, a master of ceremonies. Except this person actually had more responsibilities than that. Now the conflict of the story is that sometime, probably on the first day or the second day, they ran out of wine at this wedding feast. Now, we might not think that's such a big deal, but for the couple and for the family that this was happening to, that was a social disaster. Mary knew that Jesus could help this couple save face. Jesus goes and he finds these 6 stone jars that are used for the rites of Jewish purification. What we're talking about here is the ceremonial washing they had to do before they could go to the temple and enter into the presence of God. You see, in the Old Testament law, there were a lot of things that people had to do to come into God's presence. First, their sins had to be atoned for, but they also had to be physically, ceremonially clean to come into the temple to offer their sacrifices and to worship. And so the idea is that impurity is separating people from God. So Jesus chose these stone jars that are used for the ceremonial washing to come into the presence of God, to hold the water that he was going to turn into wine. He gets these jars, and the servants, on the instructions of Mary, they acted in faith or in desperation, but they filled up these jars to the brim with water as Jesus told them to do. The story reaches its highest tension point as Jesus tells them now to draw out some of this water, put it in a cup, bring it to the master of the feast, and give it to him so that he could approve the next round of wines for the party. Now the servants, they do it. They bring it to him. And he tastes it. And they must have been shaking in their boots because they think, we've just brought this man water. And then the master of the feast calls for the bridegroom. The bridegroom knows there's no wine left too. And so they come together. The master of the feast looks at them and he says, "This wine is amazing." He says, "Unlike everyone else at these kinds of parties, you have saved the best wine until now." Not only did Jesus save the young couple from shame, he actually elevated them to honor. John tells us that this was a sign. This was Jesus' first sign. So the story has special meaning. The symbols work like this. The wine, which ran out, is like the covenant that God made with the Israelites, with all of its purification ceremonies and sacrifices. And when Jesus came, that covenant's purpose was fulfilled. It ran out. Now Jesus, taking the water and turning it into the best wine, symbolizes his making a new and better covenant in his own blood. When Jesus' time came, he was going to save his people from the shame and the impurity that separated them from God. But he was going to do it in a permanent way, in a way that wouldn't require a sacrifice year after year after year. He was going to do this in his own blood. So why was this sign done at a wedding feast? Jesus could have made his ministry public in a variety of different ways, but instead it was saving the face of a couple by making wine at a wedding feast. In the Old Testament, Israel was sometimes called the bride of God. Well, this symbol carries forward into the New Testament, where Jesus starts referring to himself sometimes as the bridegroom. He said of his disciples, "How can they fast while the bridegroom is with them?" In Revelation, the New Jerusalem that comes down out of the sky, which is a symbol of the church, is prepared as a bride for Jesus. And on top of that, a wedding in general is just a time of joy and celebration. So this is a very, very appropriate symbol, because the story is teaching us that even though Jesus had to die to purify us and to take away our shame, the result would be everlasting joy, like a never-ending wedding feast with the best wine. Thanks for joining me, and I will see you at church on Sunday.